Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Please join me in welcoming our webcast viewers. My name is Fred Mifflin, President of the Canadian Club of Toronto. Viewers, we're very pleased that you're joining us this afternoon. For 120 years, the Canadian Club has been proud to provide a forum for leaders in every aspect of society to share their ideas with us and to challenge our thinking. Through our programs and activities, we offer access to dynamic political, business, and public figures, like today's guest speaker, the Honourable Peter Harder. Before I formally introduce Senator Harder, here's a snapshot of some of our upcoming events. Tomorrow, February 22nd, business leader and philanthropist Bonnie Brooks will receive our 2016 Lifetime Achievement Award. And next Monday, February 27th, Don Galloin, President and CEO of Manulife, will be at our podium to continue our global Canadian business leadership on the global stage. To order your tickets or to learn more about the club, please visit us at canadianclub.org. You can also join the conversation via Twitter and Instagram by following us at CDNCLUBTO or by using that hashtag. I want to express special thanks to our sponsor today, Canada Life Assurance, represented by Gary Senth. Thank you for your generous support. I also want to recognize the youth and young leaders who are with us today from the University of Toronto and the Scarborough Academy for Technological, Environmental, and Computer Education at W.A. Porter Collegiate Institute, sponsored by TD Bank Group and the Carpenters District Council of Ontario. Welcome and thank you for joining us. And now our guest speaker today. Canada's Senate has emerged from a tumultuous period where its purpose and future were hotly debated and challenged. That tide appears to be changing. Now, in 2017, the Senate is embracing change. It has taken on a transformational agenda with a focus on being more independent, accountable, and transparent. One of the newest additions to the senatorial ranks is Peter Harder, the government representative who was appointed last March. He's now positioned to be a strong advocate for reforming the upper chamber. As the government representative, he will bring forward government legislation to a chamber whose members are appointed under a new merit-based system. Prior to his appointment, Senator Harder helped transition the Liberal Party to govern after the 2015 election. No stranger to Parliament Hill, he spent almost 30 years in the federal public service, 16 of those as a deputy minister. He brings a deep understanding of government administration and has headed 6 different departments, including Foreign Affairs, International Trade, and the Treasury Board Secretariat. Senator Harder also brings strong international experience to the Senate. He served as the personal representative, or as I learned at lunch, the Sherpa, to the Prime Minister for 3 G8 summits. He's an expert on Canada-China relations and served as president the China-Canada Business Council in 2008. Senator Harder is an engaged community advocate and leader. He's lent his expertise to a number of causes and organizations, including the United Way, the National Arts Centre, and the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. At the conclusion of his formal remarks, Senator Harder has agreed to take questions, so I would encourage you to fill out the Q&A cards on your tables, and one of our volunteers will be happy to collect them. Senator Harder, welcome. The Canadian Club of Toronto's podium is yours.
That's great.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Frank, or Fred. I'm very pleased to be here, and I want to know that those are questions that you can send me. Applications go to a different address. It's a pleasure for me to be in Toronto and Perhaps a little circumspect for an Ottawa senator to come to Toronto, but usually that's hockey, not the enterprise in which I'm engaged in. I want to thank the Canadian Club for hosting this event, and I want to in particular thank the sponsors for the lunch. I had the pleasure of being on the board of Great West Lifeco and some of the related companies, and I see also Jim Temerty here from Northland. I had the pleasure of being on that board, and I see friends from Magna here, and I had some great times on that board, as well as some of the not-for-profit organizations with which I've been delighted to be associated. And in particular, I would recognize the Glenn Gould Foundation, which is certainly not a profit organization, but worthy of support. So it's a delight to be here in Toronto with old friends from my past, and to also see so many young people as part of this luncheon. I had the pleasure of speaking with them beforehand and encouraging them, senators, to think of a career that could include a period in the Senate, but perhaps not right away. I also want to recognize and thank senator colleagues, both former senators and sitting senators, for participating today, including at the back there I see Trevor Eaton, one of the long-serving senators who's retired a little before you did, and is continuing to participate in public life, both as a corporate director and otherwise. So Trevor, nice to see you. As I mentioned, it's not always easy to come to a city like Toronto and say, I want to talk about the Senate. There was a time when perhaps that wouldn't have been the easiest thing to do. And I'm coming without a punchline when I say I'm a senator, because quite frankly, I'm sick of the punchlines of the Senate. I believe it's a noble institution doing good work and is engaged in an important change process, which is what I want to talk to you about. The times are changing and have changed considerably in the short period of a year. It was only last March when 7 Canadians, myself included, became the first senators appointed under a new process to which Fred referred, which was a process aimed at renewing the role of the Senate and rebuilding Canadians' trust in it. Today, the number of independent senators stands at 42, and a plurality in an upper house that is becoming increasingly vital and ever more detached from partisanship of the past. This is literally a story in the making. I mentioned it at the beginning of my remarks to remind you that although our renewal project is in its early days, we are making real progress towards a Senate that is less partisan, more independent, accountable and transparent, and relevant to Canadians' lives in their everyday and in their public expression of public policy and life. Over this short period, the national conversation about the Senate has steadily moved away from patronage, scandal, and legitimacy towards a discussion over how it should best fulfill the role that the Fathers of Confederation envisaged, that of an independent chamber acting as a steadying balance to the elected House of Commons. As change materializes, Canadians are beginning to glimpse at the Senate's important role in helping to make good law and good public policy. This includes how the Senate focuses on aspects of a bill that may not have been exhaustively scrutinized by the Commons, how it incorporates the contributions of Canadians who may not have had their words or views previously heard, and how it can provoke national discussion by studying issues that can be politically delicate. Let's be clear off the top. Canada would not exist today had the Fathers of Confederation not agreed to the need for an upper chamber to act as a safeguard on the powers of the majority of the House of Commons. To underscore its importance in the debate, the founders of Confederation at their Charlottetown conference spent 6 of the 14 days of negotiating the text of Confederation and in Quebec City to cobble together the Confederation Accord on the subject of the Senate. It was that important an institutional compromise to be accorded that degree of attention. And it was, and I consider this particularly ironic given his appetite for drink, it was Sir John A. Macdonald who coined the phrase sober second thought as a way to describe the Senate as a complementary body designed to regulate legislation initiated by the elected House of Commons. Our canny first Prime Minister and his colleagues also built a Senate that mandated equality of numbers amongst the founding divisions or regions of Canada. Initially, 24 in Quebec, 24 for Upper Canada, Ontario, and 24 for the Maritimes. The upper chamber was to provide a moderating voice on behalf of the smaller regions as well as for our nation's minorities within those divisions. It would not be an exaggeration to argue without guaranteeing numerical equality in these divisions, the Confederation bargain itself would not have been achieved. Remember, it took actually 2 referenda lost in the Maritime provinces for them to see this equivalency of regional weight as the solution to found our country. And on a period in which we're reflecting on our sesquicentennial, let's remind ourselves of the institutions that were created as a result of the bargains that were shaped in Quebec City and in Charlottetown. The founders also exhibited keen judgment by insisting that the Senate be appointed, not elected. While the upper chamber has essentially the same powers as the House, save for money bills, the fact that it is not popularly elected serves as a check on its own power. While the Senate chamber can block, amend, or postpone legislation, its non-elected makeup helps to restrain it from overreaching. Our country's founders knew full well that, as an appointed chamber, the Senate would not have the political legitimacy to act as a perennial rival to the House of Commons. Instead, it would nearly always defer to the clear will of the people as expressed in the politically accountable chamber of the House. They were right. But the fathers also wanted a Senate to be a check on the excesses of winner-take-all majority rule, a role that is particularly relevant given the nearly limitless powers that majority governments wield in Canada, often with less than 40% of the vote. The Senate was the safety valve of the Confederation deal. This is something often lost in historical translation, as modern-day pundits focus enthusiastically on the unelected nature of the Red Chamber, as they suggest that there is an illegitimacy to an unelected body. If the Senate were to have become an elected chamber, I would argue that it would act as a rival to the House of Commons, not a complementary check, and a much guaranteed outcome would be a deadlock which would frustrate Canadians and have them call for either its abolishment, its repeal, or perhaps even the sense that regional voices would no longer be heard in the Federation. Finally, I want to remind that it was the old chieftain Macdonald himself who insisted that the Senate be independent in its deliberations in order to insulate itself from the rough and tumble that characterized partisan politics in the House of Commons. He said, and I quote, "It must be an independent House having free action of its own." One of the objectives sought by the fathers through the appointive system was to endow the Senate with independence from the electoral process to which members of the House of Commons were, of course, and rightly subjected. The system was designed to remove senators from a partisan political arena that required unremitting consideration of short-term political objectives. It's a testament to the founders' wisdom that the reasons for establishing the upper chamber are as valid today as they were at the time, or perhaps even more so. To the founders' aims, we can add the fact that Canada has become an increasingly complex nation to run, and government which does so has broadened its reach into nearly all sectors of society. The executive branch is increasingly powerful, and that power is concentrated in the hands of very few. Strong oversights, like those which can be provided by the Senate, consistent with the Father's intent, are indeed needed more today than at any other time in our nation's history. The founders' view of and need for the Senate was underscored by no less than the Supreme Court of Canada in their ruling of 2014, which recognized that the Senate plays an integral role in our nation's democratic life. The decision of the Supreme Court made it clear that any effort to fundamentally alter the institutional design of the Senate would require a round of constitutional negotiations between the federal government and the provinces. For example, transforming the Senate into an elected institution would require the agreement of at least 7 provinces representing a combined population of more than 50% of Canada. The Supreme Court also confirmed that outright abolition of the Senate would require the unanimous agreement of provinces and the federal government. I'm sure you would all agree that the prospect of those amendments of constitutional reform are far in the distant, if at all. Moreover, the court confirmed that at its core, the Senate is meant to be Canada's less partisan and more independent complementary chamber of thought. So on the Senate's fundamental role in our political system, the 1867 Pact of Confederation and the Supreme Court's decision of 2014 are on the same page. At the same time, it was obvious in 2014, as it is today, that the Senate was not living up to its promise and had, as you described, Fred, eloquently, some issues a few years back on accountability. This tarnished image by expense scandals and the need for further public scrutiny revealed a Senate that was increasingly consumed by partisanship and top-down control by the then Prime Minister's office. To say that the institution went astray is an understatement in the extreme. With constitutional reform out of the question, could anything be done to salvage the upper chamber? I think a considerable part of the solution was provided in 2014 by Justin Trudeau, then the leader of the third party in the House of Commons. While he was astute enough to see that the Senate was not fulfilling the role that the fathers had intended, he also believed that a form of non-constitutional reform could best restore the Senate's tattered reputation. And he took action, the full impact of which might not have been realized at the time, by removing the then Liberal senators from his national caucus. This set off a chain of events, the consequences of which we are still reaping the benefits of. The Senate, he said, had become a little more than a partisan echo chamber of the House because of the party structure that existed within it. At best, the Senate had become redundant, and at worst, it amplified the power of the Prime Minister's office instead of checking it. So while the decision to sever ties with Liberal senators may have seemed to some like tinkering, for the Senate, it was a transformational moment. For almost 150 years, the Senate had been dominated by the duopoly of Liberals and Conservatives. But now, one of the two parties had cut its supporters loose and relinquished a key lever of partisan advantage. Mr. Trudeau added at the time that should he become Prime Minister, his goal would be to get back to the basics and make the Senate a more independent and complementary non-partisan chamber. Now, last year, now Prime Minister Trudeau took another crucial step in restoring the Senate's credibility by implementing the partisan-free and merit-based arm's-length appointment process. This new process allows Canadians who qualify, that is, you've got to be over 30, and you've got to have a tremendous amount of cash on hand, I think $5,000, allows individual Canadians who qualify to make an application to an independent advisory board. 27 individuals have been appointed in this process, and they now sit in the chamber as independents unaffiliated with any political party. Unlike the past, their votes are not whipped. Party line does not exist for them. Understandably, critiques of reform have emerged, and two of the more prevalent ones are taking opposite and different tacks. The first imagines that the Senate will become so empowered by the elimination of party discipline that they will brashly assert their former powers in counterpoint to the House of Commons. The second argument holds the polar opposite, that the renewed Senate will become little more than an advisory committee to the House because of its detachment from true political organization of the day. My own view is that the truth will be found in the sweet spot of sober second thought put forward by the founders. Senators will generally subordinate themselves to the House by virtue of the fact that they are appointed. But they will also cease to be a mirror of the House because of the removal of party discipline. For now, the loosening of the Prime Minister's prerogative of appointing senators has translated into some unpredictable outcomes for government legislation. As the government's representative in the Senate, I can definitely attest to this. The corollary, of course, is that this new independence has produced some robust reviews, debates, and amendments over bills. Last June, for example, our country was engrossed in an important legislative debate on how allowing physicians to help Canadians face a terminal condition by ending their own lives. Senators made an important contribution, which included an amendment to broaden the eligibility for assisted dying beyond those facing foreseeable death. Many senators argued that, absent broad eligibility, the existing legislation was not constitutional. The government and the House of Commons disagreed with this view. When the bill came back to the Senate, members appropriately yielded to the will of the elected chamber. But while they weren't successful in changing the fundamentals of the bill, they did trigger a nationwide debate on the issues of eligibility for assisted dying, and other important amendments that were put forward by the Senate were in fact accepted by the House of Commons and the government. Similarly, 2 months ago, a group of senators led by independent Senator Andre Pratt, a former editor of the Montreal-based La Presse, owned by our friends at Power, objected to provisions in a bill establishing new federal consumer protection measures under the Bank Act. Senator Pratt argued that the proposed federal law undermined the principle of cooperative federalism. It treaded on provincial jurisdiction under civil law and ultimately afforded less robust protections to consumers than those provided under similar legislation in Quebec. Now, the federal government could have tried to shape the debate by asserting its legal authority over the banking sector. But instead, Minister Morneau chose cooperation over potential division and agreed to bring a separate bill to the House of Commons and the Senate at a later date after appropriate consultations with stakeholders. On yet another bill dealing with gender discrimination related to passing down Indian status under the Indian Act, the government accepted a recommendation from the Senate committee to seek a court extension to allow for wider consultation with Indigenous communities. There are, of course, those who argue that the new independents are all just small L liberals dressed in independence clothing because their appointment was ultimately made by that Satan liberal Prime Minister Trudeau. I would invite you, though, to look at the resumes of these new parliamentarians, not only for the individual levels of accomplishment, but for the various fields from which they were appointed. Our new senators include a former police commissioner, a former CEO of the credit union movement, an expert on Asia, an advocate for prisoners' rights, a former bank vice chairman and chief operating officer, a physician and university professor whose medical practice provides seniors with services and end-of-life patients care in their dying days. A number of senators are members of the Order of Canada, including Ratan Ahmedvar, who happens to be at the head table here, and one of our dear colleagues in the original group of 7. Senator Ahmedvar has been a tireless advocate of diversity issues and is sponsoring important legislation before the Senate now on Canadian citizenship. So those who think that new senators arrive with their minds made up miss another key point. While it would be fallacious to argue that the independent senators don't come from public life with some views already formed, the real point is that they cannot be dictated to. It is their judgment that we are seeking. As government representatives, I have no caucus to direct, no favors to give, no privileges to revoke. Any influence I exercise depends on my ability to persuade. This new freedom from party discipline also provides the general public with the opportunity to exert more of its own influence. Consultations with stakeholders, industry associations, and members of civil society will have more meaning for participants than in the past. Those who recognize that senators are no longer beholden to strict party discipline have been informed as to how better to utilize the opportunities of Senate committees. I want to give you an example. An executive from the Canadian Automobile Association involved in a recent automobile safety bill that Senator Eggleton had the pleasure of participating in said the following after this experience, and I quote, "A whole lot of people are going to have to get to know a whole lot of senators a lot better than they used to." So while the Senate exercises its newfound independence on legislative matters, its work identifying and triggering debate on issues crucial to Canada's future continues, and I think it will be enhanced. The tagline on the Independent Senate Liberals website refers to Canada's Senate as the original think tank, while Historica Canada has described it as Canada's best think tank. I think it's hard to argue with this. The Senate's excellent work over the past year includes a report recommending a national campaign to combat dementia, a timely study on Canada's trade policy, a current study on what is entailed in transitioning to a low-carbon economy. Permit me to also give a shout-out again to Senator Eggleton, who led with his Senate colleagues a very important study on combating obesity, which was released in September, I believe, more or less. Senator Eggleton, as you would know, he's one of my former ministers, is the deputy chair of the Committee on Social Affairs, Science and Technology, and this committee has done extraordinarily important work on health, foods, combating trans fat content, and is now engaged in a land break study of artificial intelligence in the health sector. Aside from the appointment of independents, other important alternatives are also taking place. For instance, government ministers now appear in the Senate for question period once a week, and the Senate has increased its transparency by adopting new proactive disclosure models for Senate expenses and attendance records. We are also examining the prospect of broadcasting all Senate procedures when the Senate moves to the conference center scheduled for next year. Broadcasting of Senate business has been too slow in coming forth, and broadcasting of the Senate would, I believe, have significantly insulated the behaviors that we reflect on if it had taken place actually at the time 3 years ago. I see a broadcaster. So these reforms are notable, but as I said at the outset, this project is far from finished and a number of issues remain to be resolved. For example, I regularly get asked how a Senate without political parties can organize itself. How can an independent senator who opposes government legislation get other colleagues to join her or him in that opposition without being part of a political party that acts as an organizing tool? It's important to understand that a Senate reformed along independent lines would not prevent members from coming together in all sorts of like-minded affinity groups, be they regional or issue-oriented, minority languages, business, military affairs, and the like. Second, I am mindful that many of our changes are very new and not yet cemented in the public mind or indeed in Senate rules and procedures. This needs urgent priority attention. We have had the Senate Modernization Committee reports before us for the last number of months with excellent suggestions that have not yet advanced far enough to literally ensure the sustainability of the changes they suggest. Many politicians, including some within the Senate itself, would prefer that we maintain the upper chamber as a traditional partisan place with an official opposition caucus and one for the government. Their views are sincerely held, but at the end of the day, we've decided to take an independent path. In that spirit, I'd like to spend a few minutes left discussing the need to maintain positive momentum and not to forget what the public demands of us. Just as I arrived in the Senate a year ago, an Nanos research survey found that 3 in 4 Canadians believe that senators should vote independently of any party caucus, a result that helps confirm the road we're on. That same poll, however, also found that only 14% of Canadians preferred that senators be members of a political caucus, party caucus. The survey also made clear that Canadians' old concerns are not far from the surface. With 2/3 of the respondents saying they had a negative impression of senators generally. We've got work to do. That said, I believe that faith in our project is growing, but we must assure Canadians that we are getting on with our work by comprehensively debating the issues before us and ultimately voting on them in a timely fashion. This is something we are working on and must do better at. It is all well and good to deliberate and to debate, but we must also decide. Senator Ahmedvar has a bill that was tabled in the Senate in June on important citizenship amendments, which has not yet reached third reading. We have important legislation on transgender equality rights, which was tabled in November, that has not had one speech by the opposition opposing it, but the bill has not advanced even to committee. Deliberate, debate, but also decide. We need to advance our legislative agenda. Canadians who may be affected by important legislation can't be kept waiting indefinitely, and that, unfortunately, is what is happening too often now. I also believe that we must move more quickly to establish an independent oversight mechanism that provides an extra layer of review on Senate expenditures, as well as providing governance advice. When the focus on the Senate is all about spending, it removes attention from the work we should and are doing on behalf of all Canadians. So let me close by saying that all the soaring talk about renewal only matters if it reaffirms in Canadians' mind what the Senate is supposed to do, and that is look after their interests, ensure that the legislation is well thought out, that governance and public policy issues are debated at the highest level. Our job is not to make the Senate look good or individual senators feel good. It's to deliver the goods for Canadians. Let me thank you for coming out today and listening, and if I can be help in advancing this conversation in the months and years ahead, I'd be happy to return. And in the meantime, I would ask you to speak to your friends, students, business colleagues, and others on the importance of this initiative, and I'm sure the country will be much obliged. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Senator. I've received some questions, and if people have others, please fill out the Q&A cards. The first question is I have two that are roughly similar. The Prime Minister has recently abandoned electoral reform. How do we know that the same will not happen to Senate reform? And I'm going to ask the second question, which says, absent a legislation constitutional change, how durable are the current changes in the Senate selection process? So they're essentially the same question.
This is a work in progress. But I would point out that, as I said, there are 42 independent senators named now. We have, in addition to that, 19 independent Liberal senators. So the independents, nonpartisan associated Senate group has a majority. And there are 5 vacancies now, not that I'm counting, and there are further vacancies that will be filled in the course of this year. So the Prime Minister will have 8 more appointments this year and 7 the year after. I'm simply pointing out that this movement of new senators appointed through this process, coming with an independent spirit and judgment, is likely to continue at least until the next election, and we'll see. But that gives us time to make more sustainable the changes and advances that have been made. Nothing is guaranteed because it is about people. But to the extent that politicians are held politically accountable, I mean, I'd love somebody to ask one of the 14 or 15, how many candidates there are for Conservative leadership, whether their intention, should they be Prime Minister, would be to return to appointment of, without advice, of party-related bag persons or organizers or failed candidates, or whether they would respect a more independent approach, this one or another one. We have to make more sustainable the direction that I'm discussing and describing, and our rules and procedures have to make that the fallback and the expected proposition. I would also suspect that before the next election there ought to be amendments to the Parliament of Canada Act, in as much as there are some amendments to the Act. But you know, at the end of the day, prime ministers are prime ministers, governments are governments, and they can make changes. But to the extent that we demonstrate that the changes we are engaged in are serving the public interest, I believe they will be compelling and more difficult to change. So without reference to electoral reform, which would be a bit ironic for a Canadian senator to speak about, I believe that the to a less partisan, more independent, accountable, transparent, and complementary Senate to the House of Commons is well grounded, and we're off to a great start.
Okay. This next question, I'm going to leave it to you to fill in the blank to protect either the innocent or the guilty. Does the new Senate appointment system end the appointments of people like blank?
Well, I hope they don't end the appointment of people like Art Eggleton, who was an outstanding mayor, had political experience, and was appointed. I am not against partisanship as a life experience, and as an experience that can find its way to the Senate in a helpful way. What I'm speaking against is partisanship as an organizing principle in the Senate. If the blank is a politician, I frankly don't see it that way. If it is that the sole qualification is a political motivation or an aspiration to use the Senate as a bulwark against a particular prime minister, I hope it is.
Okay, thank you. I like this question. This has nothing to do with the Senate. It's from one of our students. You've had a lot of success in your career, but in your role as a civil servant, what would have to be your greatest accomplishments, and how did it lead to your current position?
Well, I had the pleasure of working as a deputy minister in a number of departments, and I'm always asked, which one did you like best? And it sounds corny, but the real answer is I like the one I was in at the time best, because like ministers, you don't know when you're moving. And I started as a deputy minister of immigration at a time of great turmoil in immigration areas, and I formed lifelong friendships and am gratified by what we were able to accomplish. Similarly, at Treasury Board, where I had the pleasure of working with the Minister Eggleton and other ministers, those were great years. Foreign Affairs, who could say that wasn't interesting? But the most important accomplishment, I can't judge because the deputy minister is there for the accomplishment of others. But I can tell you what I learned. I learned that a successful senior executive in the public service has got to be comfortable telling truth to power. And I don't mean that in a cliche. I have a particular experience in my mind where a then Prime Minister told me they didn't like what I was doing, and I was racing through my mind what of all of the things I was doing he could possibly be speaking of, and we got into a debate on a particular issue. And he raised his points, and finally I raised mine, and he looked across the table at me and said, well, if that's what you think, go ahead and do it. It was an engagement. It wasn't a decree, oh, if that's what you think, I'm running out of here and doing it. There was so be courageous in your views, but not arrogant in your opinion, and be loyal in the implementation. That's what a public service is all about.
Should the Senate have maximum term limits to ensure renewal on an ongoing basis?
If I'm constrained by constitutional prohibition, that is to say, everything that is constitutionally, that requires a constitutional amendment is off the table, I have to say no. You can't do that. If I look at how renewal of senators' experience is beneficial for the institution, I would say, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I would encourage self-governing by appointees than pretending I could deliver this when constitutional reform of this sort is off the table. So let's hold individual senators accountable for their own ongoing creativity and commitment and engagement.
Okay. We have time for one more question, and if I didn't get to everybody, I apologize. And in fact, there are two that are very similar again. When you have 105 independent senators with 105 separate opinions, how can you ensure that they will come to agreement on anything? Isn't this a recipe for gridlock? And the corollary to that is, what parts of the Westminster model can we keep, and what do we have to reinvent?
Both very good questions. By the way, reducing it to 105 opinions would be helpful. I don't see it that way. I do see that senators have natural areas of interest, and over time they become both informed and have affinities across organizational structures on those issues and help frame the debate for all senators. I don't think it's a bunch of automatons out there. I also think that there is a greater understanding today than perhaps about what does independence mean. It's not your opinion is welcomed, it's your judgment is welcomed. And how do you exercise your judgment as an independent senator? Not pretend a bill is coming and what would I do if I was writing the Immigration Act? It's how do I judge what the government has proposed in accordance with a framework that I'm applying, whether it's constitutional, whether it's in their jurisdiction, whether it protects minority rights, whether it advances and it has had appropriate stakeholder engagement, that sort of thing. So I frankly don't think the challenge is gridlock in that sense. The challenge is harnessing differences and then advancing in the face of a particular piece of legislation. And I do believe that all senators of goodwill are anxious to see the Senate achieve the level of public understanding and support that the institution requires to be viewed as a legitimate institution of governance.
Great. Thank you very much, Senator. I'd now like to invite Jennifer Sloan, past president, to thank.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As Fred mentioned, my name is Jennifer Sloan. I'm the Vice President of Public Policy at MasterCard and a very proud past president of the Canadian Club of Toronto. And Fred, when you were reading off the senator's bio, Frank McKenna and I were looking at each other and we reminded the senator, he's our former boss. When Frank was the ambassador to Washington and I was serving in our Canadian consulate in New York City, we were essentially public servants. And our boss was the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, and that was you, Senator. So we remember those times fondly. And so on behalf of the Canadian Club today, I'd like to thank you for outlining the historic change that is taking place in the upper house. Bringing change to an ages-old institution is challenging, to be sure. But as you mentioned, it's imperative that the Senate work to renew our faith in the chamber of sober second thought. We appreciate the details of these modernization plans, Senator, and as the government's representative, it is reassuring to know that you bring such a depth of experience of the federal public servants to your role. With renewed focus on being less partisan and more modern, the new application-based appointment system will contribute to achieving these important objectives. We thank you for your service that you've contributed to the federal civil service in the past and wish you much success on your senatorial journey. And before we conclude, may I please extend another round of thanks to today's sponsor, Great Canadian Life Assurance. We'd also like to thank MediaEvents.ca, Canada's online event space, and VVC for live streaming today's event. To learn more about the club, please visit us at thecanadianclub.org. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. Our meeting is now adjourned.